Zoom subscriptions and Meetup and so on possible for us, and that's IO, which is a development and design company in Cape Town. You can check them out, IO Digital, if to be precise, and that's io.co.za. And then the other company is NML, also a software development and design company in Cape Town, and that's nml.co.za. Yeah, so thanks to them for keeping the lights on, so to speak. So tonight we have Schalk, who's going to be talking to us about the Jamstack. You can welcome to post questions in the chat, and we'll monitor that, and I'll relay them to Schalk as we go along. Schalk, would you like us to interrupt you, or would you prefer to go to the end?
I think interruptions are in order.
Okay, so I'll just wave to you, and when a question comes in, and then I'll relay it to you.
No, it's fine. Martin can maybe also help out a bit with that, because the thing is, like the topic itself is quite dense, and it touches on a lot of things, you know, from like microservices to the history of the web and so forth. So, yeah, please interrupt, because I guess if someone misses something, some of the other things might not make sense.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. Thanks, Schalk. Over to you.
Okay, cool. So first and foremost, I have some bad news for those of you that kind of joined in specifically to listen to Gareth. Unfortunately, due to circumstances outside of his control, he isn't able to make tonight. But we have had him before, and we're definitely going to have him again. Like, I think he's pretty popular with kind of like the front-end crowd as well. But yeah, so unfortunately he can't make it. So this will be kind of a solo show. That being said, I obviously didn't prepare that much. Well, we'll see. Like I tend to actually over prepare. So, but the point being that we might just spend a bit more time kind of discussing things, kind of a bit of back and forth and so forth. But I think if there's ever a topic that would benefit from like more discussion, it is kind of the Jamstack, just because it is one of those things that's kind of still like taking form as we speak. Yeah, it's not as easy as just saying, hey, this is what it is. So there is a lot of like interesting discussion to be had there and so forth. Yeah, so I just told Justin beforehand, so we generally introduce the speakers, but because I do a fair bit of teaching nowadays, I kind of have ready to go. I have ready to go slides that I can just use to introduce myself. So I'll save him some time. And yeah, also like it's one of those things. I had a like when he did his typography talk, it's actually very hard introducing someone that you know, because you kind of forget like kind of what are the things that people who don't know them would be interested in. But that being said, yeah, like who am I? So my name is Schalk. I've been doing front-end development now for more than a decade. Started out back when it was still called web design. And web design was kind of something that you just do alongside like regular graphic design. So like you do a website in the same way you would do a CD cover or a poster or a flyer or whatever, you know, essentially we just draw it up in Photoshop and you would slice it up and like put the spacer GIFs and whatever in and put it in a table and there's your website, you know. So I've kind of been working with the web for a very long time, even before like kind of there was even a distinct difference between front end and back end. I do quite a lot of teaching. I did mention in the beginning that I have some students. So yeah, some of you might know these places. At the moment, I am actively teaching at Codex, Codespace, Academy of Digital Arts, and Creative Academy. Yeah, so I kind of have a couple of students as well, which is nice because it forces you to really think through kind of like the way you approach your work, because you always need to almost defend it in a certain degree. And then I'm kind of very active in the community as well. So obviously FedSA, or FedSA, where we are currently at, like, so I'm one of the co-founders along with Justin. So we kind of operate this. Then I'm also kind of I also co-maintain the ZA Tech and ZA Product Design Slack workspaces. If you are not on those, I would highly encourage you guys check it out. Like, it's really, really helpful. The ZA Tech one is absolutely huge. We have about like 12,000 members. The ZA Product Design one is pretty recent. I think it's a bit older than a year now. So it's been slowly growing, but that tends to be more towards the kind of product design side of things, and not necessarily the tech per se. Then I've, over the years, done a lot of like open source contributions, done some like small things on TypeScript, Storybook, Preact. I've actually done quite a bit, and so forth. And I've also done quite a bit of contract work. So for like the Google Foundation, for National Treasury, I've even done writing work for CSS-Tricks and Daily Maverick and so forth. And I also have a life outside of work, which is me at my birthday on the top left side, me at my bachelor's in the middle at the top, me at CodeBridge at the bottom, and me and my wife. And for those of you that don't know, I'm actually expecting a daughter come September. So this slide is going to hopefully be updated pretty soon. So very excited about that. And then, yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm always just super keen to like chat with people, discuss things. Yeah, you can reach out to me on any of these, or just like if you found this event via Meetup, you can just send me a message directly on Meetup. All right, so with that being said, let's actually get to the talk itself. So tonight I want to talk about the Jamstack. It is quite intimidating topic to talk about. As I did mention previously, it touches on so many different things, from microservices to CDNs, to like static site generators, yeah, and even the history of the web. So it is quite a daunting topic to tackle. So I might go, I've tried to kind of predict what might be worth going into, what might not be worth going into. I often find that the technical aspects aren't that interesting. There's 100 of videos online on how to install Gatsby, how to set up 11T. So I'm not necessarily going to be getting into that. I think like there are a lot of people like that do that a lot better than I do. I perhaps just want to chat about like where I kind of see the Jamstack fitting in, and what it is essentially, and also kind of what problems it solves, and what type of projects it's a good fit for. But so essentially, if this is the first time you're hearing about it, it's the J, A, and M. It used to be kind of capitalized, so similar to kind of the lamp stack and so forth. This year, it was kind of changed to just like be like a word. For better or for worse, I don't know, like I think it's just going to confuse people even more. But like, I think it's one of those things that like they kind of regretted like including the name stack in it, because people might like kind of see it within the same paradigm as like a lamp stack or a mean stack or something. So it is a tech stack in a very broad sense, but it's not within that same paradigm. And so, yeah. But so let's get into that. So there's 3 things I want to touch on. I think it's important to kind of understand, like, briefly the history of the web, and in order to kind of understand where the Jamstack fits in and where it comes from. And I think then it's very important to kind of talk about the last, let's say, 7 years, which has been like not a great time to be working on the web. So like this is an actual quote. I never know how to pronounce his name, but he is actually one of the members on the TC39 and W3C. And he once mentioned that the web is a write once, cry everywhere platform. And I think, like, I specifically want to speak to kind of just like the awkward couple of years and the last couple of years, and how I kind of see the Jamstack as one possible way out of the kind of just the mess that we are in terms of the web. But so before I start with that, let me maybe kind of give a bit of an introduction in terms of how I came to the web. So I think my first introduction to the web was in 1969. So just to give a bit of context, like how long ago that was, you know, Spice Girls released Wannabe as a single. Hunchback of Notre Dame came out. We like fashion was very questionable. And the actual Princess Diana got formally divorced. And I took karate lessons. Look at that guy. Yeah. And we got our first like modem, 56K US robotics. And with that, I got my hands on like a pirated version of this thing. I don't know if any of you guys know what this is. Justin, you might like know what this is. It was like
good old front page.
Yes, even before it was purchased by Microsoft. Like what it was like Veneer, or what was it?
I can't remember.
Yeah, it was a different company, but yeah. And I think that was my introduction to the world of web. Like I would just like play around, like make like web pages in front page, like about weird things like Pokemon or whatever like a kid at that age does. And you know, like, and that was the state of the web. This is very much what the web looked like, thanks to front page, you know, because now all of a sudden anyone could just upload things to FTP, to GeoCities, and just host it online. And but it wasn't just like kind of people like me that were kind of playing around with this thing called the web. Like there were a lot of companies that were actually exploring this space. So this was something called Auction Web. It's a precursor to eBay. So they kind of rebranded as eBay at a later point. This is one of the first like real commercial websites. And then Pizza Hut. So this is all 1969. These websites were launched. So Pizza Hut launched their website. And like, I love that contact form, which is just like essentially a submit form with a name and a street address and a phone. And I guess that just sends an email, but that is their website. Like you can click on a button to see the menu, and I can't even imagine how that works. Like your name, your street address, and your phone. Do they call you then to figure out what you want, or yeah, I don't know. And Nintendo also launched their website. Like look at that super creative, like horizontal scroll up there. Apple also launched their website, and Coca-Cola, which was kind of like one of the like most quote unquote well-designed websites at the time. And you know, like Justin will also know that this is kind of what HTML looked like at the time. Like it, strangely enough, HTML, like a lot of people wrote HTML in all caps. It was only with the advent of HTML4 that the spec actually said you should write it all in lowercase. And also you'll see like there's no CSS at this point yet. So there's a lot of things like, a font tag, and you put like the align inside as attributes and so forth. And it's interesting because like kind of this, where the web was at this point was kind of very against what Sir Tim Berners-Lee, kind of who originally conceived of the internet, thought it was going to be. So he actually envisioned a read and write web. So it's kind of strange for us to imagine nowadays, but I think like what he envisioned and how it actually turned out, like for him, it didn't turn out anything like he imagined, but he very much imagined like this, like as a user, you'd be able to make changes, or I guess it would work like a Google Doc where you would make maybe suggested changes, add like photos of your own Coca-Cola, and yeah, I guess something like Wikipedia perhaps. So that's very much what he had in mind. But what emerged at the time was kind of essentially a read-only web. And, like you needed an account with an ISP to host your website, specialized tools, and so forth. And then something happened. And it is very kind of strange to explain just like how big this was. I was a student I was at university when this really went mainstream. And like I remember this is just like what everyone talked about. It was kind of like the fourth industrial revolution equivalent of like 2005. Yeah, and it's essentially that the web is no longer a read-only medium. You don't upload things, static things with HTML and so forth. Now the web is actually, people are going to build platforms where users upload their own content. And I actually found a like promotional video from Design Indaba 2007, and I was actually there. And I just remember like it's strange, like even looking at this video, looking at the cars, like you can, like it seems so dated, like it's weird. 2007 feels like not that long ago, but it's actually a very long time ago. Yeah, like they essentially, the entire Design Indaba just went about Web 2.0. It was such a big thing, and this is from like some of the like I've embedded the video here in the slides. I'll probably share the slides if you want to watch it. Like it's so old school, like oh, it makes me feel old. But so essentially, look at these cars, like it's so dated. It's 2007, it's crazy. But like essentially the promotional material said, since its first usage in 2004, Web 2.0 has often been dismissed as a catchphrase. Indeed, web applications that act like desktop programs and encourage collaborative and community have risen and fallen, and a new generation of web applications, technology, and most significant users are predicted. So their whole thing was like kind of about like, hey, how do we train designers for this new world that's coming? Yeah, once again, very similar kind of language that we see kind of in terms of discussions now around like the fourth industrial revolution and like AI and those things. So this term Web 2.0 actually originates from like 1999. And from a magazine called Print and it's an article by this lady. And so she summarized it essentially as, what we understood as the web at that point is essentially the equivalent of digital brochures. But that's kind of like it's kind of like the outlier, and the web was always, and it will eventually again become, a transport mechanism through which interactivity happens. And, and this is kind of like, she kind of coined it as the Web 2.0, and that's kind of where that phrase comes from. And like, the way in which we kind of headed in that direction was through an existing piece of technology that was already included in HTML. And then that was kind of like the form. So the form was kind of the de facto way for users to kind of submit data. that would traditionally be uploaded via like FTP or so forth. And you know, and like the form was a very well, to this day still is a very useful thing, you know, like it has a lot of like cultural like embedded like not like under like conventions, you know, like so obviously like this comes from like our conception of paper forms, you know, which is essentially like documents of spaces where you can fill in information, and you know they date back to almost the 19th century. And so on the left here is a like a police report form from I think like 1888. And so this idea of users being able to use forms to actually, instead of consuming data, to actually put up their own data on the platform, you know, is very much driven by this concept of like forms. And so one of the first like real Web 2.0 websites was kind of Blogger. Some of you might know it was later purchased by Google, became Blogspot, and so forth. I think it's actually still around. But essentially, yeah, you'll see like this isn't the nicest design, and it's just like, you know, essentially here's create an account, here's login. And yeah, it's weird. Like even like some of the language which have kind of become standardized over the years with login forms, like here hasn't like settled yet. So some of the things are super strange. Like for example, what we would today consider as confirm password, like they say verify password, and instead of saying like sign up or whatever, like the button just says enter when you create a new a new account, which is very strange. Yeah, same year also, like kind of eBay kind of took off. Then we kind of saw PayPal. Wikipedia was released 2001. MySpace 2003. I had a very pumping MySpace page back then. And Flickr, which I had a lot of like my design and illustration work on, and then YouTube 2005, and then Twitter 2006. So like there was a massive surge of kind of Web 2.0 sites. So in other words, sites that served as a platform for users to kind of upload and share things. And you know, like this was mostly, as I said, driven by forms. You know, so this is a really great book. It is a bit dated nowadays, but it's still a great read. This is the same guy. He's a senior product designer now at Google. Same guy who kind of coined like the concept of mobile first as well. I think he also wrote a book called Mobile First. And he kind of talks about forms, you know, he just says like you find them everywhere. So he just says just about everywhere people want to participate in social interactions online, forms get in the way. And like that turn of phrase is quite interesting, forms getting in the way. And, you know, like he's not, he's pretty straight about it that forms suck. You know, like it's not a great experience. As a user using a form, as a developer kind of using a form, creating a form, and so forth. So as part of this Web 2.0 thing, there was kind of an actual, and this specification is actually still up. It was a specification that was maintained for something called Web Forms 2.0. There was a parallel one called X Forms and so forth. And, you know, just going through this, like it's some really exciting stuff, you know, so there's kind of like this notion to have form inputs be strongly typed, add new attributes for defining constraints, repeating model for the declarative way of writing forms, where you can just like almost like this is very much like kind of a precursor to what we would consider today components, you know, new DOM interfaces, new DOM events for validation, dependency tracking, you know, and like it gets submitted with XML, and even like ways to initialize the forms. So it was very much seen as it was seen that the current way we're using forms to kind of drive the interactive web was not good enough. And so this specification was kind of seen as a way to codify things and, you know, and like add additional functionality and clarify how we should use forms. But obviously, so this, if you know anything about specifications on the web, they take a very, very long time. So this like was still very far out, as exciting as it was. And, you know, in the meantime, we kind of just went with kind of the MVC, now I'm confusing myself. Model view controller, was in model controller view, model view controller, like pattern, where essentially you have the like abstract like forms away with kind of like something like web framework, whether Ruby on Rails and Django and so forth, because working with forms is painful. And you don't want to manually write out every single form for someone to upload an image, for someone to log in, for someone to sign in, to sign out, to change their password, to add a new thing, to delete a thing. So we kind of got loads of these MVC like web frameworks. And they served us really well for a very long time. But things started getting awkward after a bit of time. I did mention, you know, that quote about like, you know, the web as a write once, cry everywhere platform. It's kind of coined by this guy, which, you know, I think it says quite a bit. The fact that he is actually a W3C and TC39 committee member. So W3C is essentially, these are the guys that actually decide conventions for the web, and TC39 is like essentially the team that's in charge of developing JavaScript. And like I say, this is kind of like an awkward phase, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is it's a bad thing, you know. Like I guess this is something that comes with a medium as open as the web. And I often look to, so this is a phenomenal book from 2019. And so he talks a bit about, like, he used to be head of design at WordPress, and like he very much speaks to kind of the space of design and like in 2019 within the digital world, and design not exclusively meaning visual, you know, design everything from being like architectural design, you know, like code patterns, you know, and things like UI design and like just how we build digital products. And he says it's like this term design is a messed up premise, you know, because it comes from a time where there's only wood, metal, glass, and, you know, we only had our hands. Whereas in the computational world, we're using alien materials, you know, like something like code or patterns or like HTTP requests or, you know, servers, even just like ADSL or fiber or whatever. It's like all these weird materials. That's nothing like building a car or a bed or a house or a kitchen. And, you know, and in the world of alien materials, the nature of products and design should change. And he remarked that design is now maturing and expects some awkwardness. And that's kind of a quote that's always kind of stuck with me, that like generally, that doesn't mean that when something is awkward, that it's in the process of maturing, but like, to me, it means more that like when something's maturing, it's going to be awkward, that way around. And, you know, like what are some real life like parallels? Teenagers. There's this phenomenal like Reddit subreddit called the Blunder Years, where people upload like kind of photos from them when they were teenagers that they kind of very much regret. It's a phenomenal subreddit. I wish I could find some photos from me that I could add here, but I just didn't have enough time. But these are some of the great ones on the subreddit. Yeah, and essentially this is where the web was, and perhaps still to a large degree is, you know, for like the last 5-7 years. Like we're kind of in between worlds. We're kind of in between this world of the web as a static medium where you upload HTML and CSS and JavaScript with FTP, and kind of a space where it's actually like a way to deliver software. and like this is kind of the thing, like what is the web nowadays? These are the type of things that we have on the web, like we have something like Trello, which has its own plugins, which have multiple people like changing things, updating things at the same time. Then we have something like Figma, which is essentially like Photoshop in the browser. Google Docs, where you can edit things in real time, Netflix. Yeah, like even this slide itself, if you look there in the bottom left corner, like even the slide itself is essentially a web page. I'm using something called slides.com. So the question is just like, how do we kind of get like from this space where, like where you have like these static websites from the early web into a space where we're actually creating software in the browser. I think there's a quote, and that's something that's oftentimes not discussed seriously enough. I think there's a phenomenal quote. Can't remember his name. The guy who essentially authored Turbo Pascal. He's also, interestingly enough, the main driving force behind TypeScript as well, in which someone asked him, like, is it possible, is it not, like, what did they ask him? They asked him, like, is it possible to write large-scale applications in JavaScript? And he said, like, yes, it is possible. It's just impossible to, like, something along the lines of, yes, it's possible to create large-scale JavaScript applications. It's just impossible to maintain them once you've created them. And I think that has been like a big discussion the last couple of years, because, like in order to move to the space here below, we have to move a lot of functionality to the browser. You can't do something like this with a purely MVC like server like controlled environment. Imagine you're using Figma and every time you open a new layer, it's a page refresh. Or every time you add a new element, it's a page refresh. Or yeah, like it's insane. Or like, let's go back to some of these examples. Like imagine Trello, like, every time you open a card, it's a new page that loads. Every time you add a comment, it's a new page that loads. Every time you change a tag, same with Google Docs. Imagine every character you type, it's a new page that loads, or when you leave a comment or so forth. So like the way we've been doing things up until this point didn't really gel that well with kind of this idea of software in the browser. And that is because the majority of the logic sits on the server. The browser is essentially just seen as a destination for the logic to be delivered to. Everything is controlled from a central server. The views are created on the server, mostly with like some static templating, like either PHP or maybe even something like Twig, or if you're using a Node server, maybe like Express and like Pug, or well, back then it used to be called Jade. And so forth. So like this notion of talking to the server all the time in order to just manage interactivity didn't really gel well with kind of our notion of software. And it wouldn't be a great experience. And sure, you could build something like this with this model. But because you can, doesn't necessarily mean it's the best experience or it's the most maintainable. And I think to illustrate that point, and this is also a really great excuse for me to show some really cool things. But here is a code pen of someone creating the Mona Lisa of CSS, mostly just using box shadows. Which is amazing in itself, but look at all these box shadows, It's clearly not what it was intended for. You can do it, theoretically. Oh, look at this. I don't even know how many lines this is. And like, try and maintain this. Let's say you want to turn her face blue or purple or whatever, like, sure, like, good luck, Yeah, so I think this is kind of a nice, like, parallel for like kind of trying to build these like software-like things with kind of a server-driven like approach. And like to show another really cool example, someone has actually built Doom, or not Doom, but they've built like a first-person shooter with CSS and HTML. And this is actually a working version. It's absolutely insane. Check this out. Ooh, okay. So you can actually just move. I'm using my keys here. This is just CSS. It is absolutely insane. Like it even has collision detection. But yeah, as you'll see, it's not the greatest experience. It's like, yeah, things like this and like just some weird like jagged things. And yeah, and also you're quite limited. Like this is just one room. But I think like it just shows like when you apply yourself, you can build almost anything with any technology. But this is what the actual HTML looks like, you know. Once again, try and maintain this. So that's a lot of what is it called? 64. I almost want to say bit 64 or base 64, like a lot of base 64 and so forth. And you know, within the world of this, these are the type of things that we kind of ended up with. This is an actual real example of code. I guess you can open up like any WordPress plugin or whatever, and you're going to find like something like this. We have like this Frankenstein mix of like the inline script tag where things are being added dynamically with PHP. And yeah, it's once again, try maintaining this. It is not fun. But, you know, because the server is supposed to control the logic, like, you know, this is the tool that you use. But luckily, you know, Web Forms 2 was still on the way. Like this was just a temporary thing. We just needed to stick with this, just like bite our tongue, just live with this until Web Forms 2.0 dropped. You know, and like, what did the spec promise? And this is directly from the spec. So the spec said, you know, it would get ease of authoring for authors who are familiar with commonly used languages such as HTML and ECMAScript being JavaScript. So you didn't need to know like any PHP or server-side language or whatever. You can just like do the logic in JavaScript and HTML alone. And very limited knowledge about XML. You don't need to know anything about data models, whatever. And like a lot simpler validation on the client side. And also dynamic addition of fields, like repeating structures on the client side. So once again, this is something that sounds very similar to what we today know as components. But here's a really great thing. Like you could use them on static pages with scripts that dynamically generate only the data part. So that means you don't even need a web server. You can literally just use this directly on a static HTML page. You don't need like a server to create that HTML for you and send it down the wire. The key here being create, because obviously it needs to be on a server to be hosted on the web. You don't need a server actually running, like creating that file for you. It can just be like a static HTML. And the specification should be implementable in full on all devices. But here's the thing. Most of you probably know how this story ends. This is all part of like the big XHTML dream. And yeah, it essentially just reached a point where we realized like this doesn't make sense. It's not possible. And I liken it kind of like to that scene in The Matrix where Neo kind of like wakes up from the Matrix and he just realizes, oh shit, like this is actually where we are at the moment. And, you know, essentially the web's governing body has to, like, essentially, this is an article from Wired Magazine, 2009, where they essentially said that, you know, XHTML is dead. Like this is kind of the point where they decided, okay, XHTML is dead. We are now just going to focus on this thing called HTML5, which, you know, turned out pretty well. But I think at that time it was really scary news and it was very disappointing. but yeah. And I think at the time a lot of people didn't realize why they now all of a sudden said they're not going to build all these amazing things anymore. Yeah, so the article just essentially says, they've decided not to renew the charter for HTML2, which is set to expire. I love the article. The article is called XHTML2 Dies a Lonely Death. And, like this is actually like one of the things that you really appreciate when you actually, like me, you read like web specs for fun is like just the graphics that are embedded in the, because like, yeah, you have a lot of like really computer science nerds who want to like illustrate like ideas. And, they are not necessarily the best when it comes to Photoshop or like Figma or that type of tooling. So it's always like, I always appreciate the graphics that are included. And this is actually from the spec itself, where it kind of shows, like we would have kind of the user, like, so the presentation, the logic, the pre-filling, the submission, all of that would be handled on the client side. And then it would use XML to kind of talk to some type of XForms processor, which I assume would be embedded in browsers. And that would kind of essentially push things up to the server and so forth. So you'd have like kind of this mediator level. But, like that, so the server wouldn't be in charge of all the logic. It would be able to like, essentially, this is essentially kind of a very early version of kind of like a view model. Yeah, I've covered quite a lot of things. Justin, I don't know if there are any questions.
Nothing at the moment, Schalk.
Okay, cool. So either like either this is really great or it's really boring. Like there's no in between here now. So essentially like what we saw then was kind of definitely shrinking and an implosion of the web. So all of this energy that we had way back with kind of the web 2.0 kind of really collapsed in on itself. And this was specifically also at the time where like the app market really took over. And and a lot of people believe this was the death of the web, that the web was kind of like an artifact of a bygone era, and that the future was apps, whether on your tablet or your mobile phone or whatever, that the web would once again just move to a space where it served static content, and most interactivity software would actually be delivered by means of actual native apps. And yeah, so I think like I have a quote here from ComScore, which has said that, like at the time, 2015, smartphones and tablets accounted for 62% of digital media time spent. Apps alone represented 54% of time that people spend on digital devices. So like at that time, the majority of time people spent in apps and not on the web. And on the left side here, like, some popular devices from 2015. Once again, they look really dated nowadays. It's crazy how fast things look like become like outdated. But then like something was kind of like happening in the web, and I don't know if you guys remember this clip of the pasta guy reviving the viral clip of the pasta guy reviving the guy from the dead. But like in my mind, this is always how I've kind of seen kind of the role that Ajax has played in the web. And so like Ajax essentially came from Microsoft actually very sneakily and with very little fanfare adding something called the XML HTTP request. And like that was kind of like at the time when Microsoft was still kind of like the big evil corporation, and they just did what they wanted, and they just added that without consulting anyone to their browser. Like Internet Explorer was the biggest browser at the time, like the market share was just like insane, so they could just do what they wanted. And so I added this, and this was a little feature that for the very first time allowed the web, like browser or JavaScript, to submit information to a server without a page refresh. You could send, this was initially intended for XML documents. We started later on using it for JSON and so forth. So this is kind of where Ajax comes from. You know, you could like now for the first time have some type of like real-time interaction without pages having to reload constantly. And, you know, like it is from this place that people started reimagining kind of like what alternative to kind of web forms or X forms would look like. And like very well-known developer nowadays, Adi Osmani, he's kind of a very senior developer at Google. At the time, he worked for AOL, actually, and he wrote this. It's kind of like a book article thing in which he said, like, you know, what he sees as the way forward. And he said essentially, we want a loosely coupled architecture with functionality broken down into independent modules. Ideally with no inter-module dependencies, and modules speak to the rest of the application when something interesting happens. And here's the key thing. There's an intermediate layer that interprets and reacts to these messages. So this kind of ended up becoming what is kind of known today as kind of the MVVM approach. So you get rid of the controller, and instead you have your model, you have your view, and then between the two you have your view model. So the view model is essentially like more like it's essentially a second model. So it's essentially where you keep things on the client state, and then that just talks to the actual model on the server or whatever. And so this is kind of like, so you remember this guy? He's the guy who said, you know, like write once, cry everywhere. So he kind of created one of the most popular MVVM kind of frameworks called Ember at the time. It very much drew on like previous things, like kind of approaches from Knockout. And so Knockout and Backbone mostly try to re-implement the MVC model in the browser. Ember wholly subscribed to this kind of MVVM approach. And like, I think the fact that a lot of teams still use Ember to this day, I think LinkedIn is completely built on Ember, I think is a testament to just like how strong of an idea Ember is. Like I can't think of anything except I guess for maybe jQuery that has kind of like stood the test of time in that manner. But essentially, yeah, so this was kind of like the most popular implementation of the MVVM approach. And, you know, and that's kind of where the first Angular JS kind of drew a lot of inspiration from Ember. And, you know, I think the rest is kind of history. You know, so like there we started seeing what would become essentially kind of a way to build like software in the browser beyond kind of like what we had known up until that point, which was kind of the MVC approach. Like it's interestingly enough that this is also kind of like there's a lot of similarities here between kind of like this MVVM approach and how Steve Jobs, like I love this graphic here on the side. I just got a random graphic on Google. Like how Apple originally envisioned like apps would work. So you can write, so this is a direct quote from Steve Jobs from 2007, where he said, you can write amazing web and Ajax apps that look exactly and behave exactly like apps on the phone. Apps can integrate perfectly with iPhone services. And guess what? There's no SDK that you need. A lot of people actually use this quote to kind of claim that like Steve Jobs ironically kind of invented the idea of a progressive web app, which is ironic just due to how opposed Apple is nowadays to progressive web apps. Yeah, and he essentially said you got everything you need if you know how to write apps using the most modern web standards to write amazing apps for the iPhone today. So he also had this idea of using kind of like the foundations of Web 2.0 and Ajax together to create essentially what would be the apps on iPhones. But, you know, that also kind of didn't pan out. And the reason being, you know, the limitations of the web at the time, you know, lack of access to core functionality, poor performance when compared to native apps. And, you know, obviously Apple's going to Apple, and they couldn't find a way to actually charge money for them. And these kind of proved insurmountable. I just find it interesting that we kind of had the same type of discussions happening within the kind of the smartphone space that we had within the kind of general like web space. And then, so what Adi Osmani kind of like recommended is that like, because we need to move a lot of the logic to the client side, and away from the server, you know, that we're essentially going to start building like really large scale JavaScript apps. And he did mention that they're non-trivial, you know, and they're going to require a significant developer effort to maintain. Like up until this point, JavaScript was mostly seen as just like a little scripting thing that you could just use to animate things or change the color of something. And like he very much kind of saw that the future would be where we would build like a lot of the core logic on the client side in JavaScript. And he said most of the heavy lifting of data manipulation and display falls to the browser. But here's the thing. So this was 2011, 2018, 7 years later. So Adi Osmani, here he still worked at AOL. Now he works at Google. He's gotten a haircut. He's gotten a bit older, and like he is regretting a bit of like his initial like optimism here for kind of like this JavaScript powered like web apps. And he wrote another article that was pretty well known. Like it received a lot of it was shared quite widely, you know. In which he said like building interactive sites can involve sending JavaScript to users. And he said essentially, you know, byte for byte JavaScript is the most expensive resource we can send. And like it's so 10 kilobytes of JavaScript is not the same as 10 kilobytes of JPEG or HTML or CSS. And he actually said, as much as I love JavaScript, it's always the most expensive part of being your site. And he kind of like reflected on like this kind of trend of just cramming everything into JavaScript, like into the client side to like build web apps, you know, and you know, especially, you know, with kind of like the early versions of React and, you know, like Vue and so forth, you know, essentially you had just an empty div, and like that would be your HTML page, and it would just like bootstrap an actual app inside that div from JavaScript. And, you know, like that, as much as that allows us to get like all this interactivity that we would expect from actual software, that is way more expensive. Creating our markup, creating our styling and so forth in JavaScript than if we were to just send it down as HTML or CSS. And, you know, and like this is kind of where the Jamstack kind of comes from, is we kind of reached a point where we had now a way of building web apps in the web that truly functioned like actual software, that truly functioned like native apps or software that you would install in the browser. You know, like we were kind of now at the point where, let me just go back to, where's that section? Oh, I went back a bit too far. Where we were building these type of things. You know, we were building the Trellos, we were building the Netflixes, we were building the Google Docs. But there was a real concern in terms of just the size of the JavaScript that we were shipping down to browsers. And, you know, so this is where the Jamstack comes in. And Well, actually, I think that, like, let me take a step back. I think Jamstack is a very good solution to that problem, but it actually has, like, it comes from several places at once. You know, it's, I think, similar to progressive web apps, or even the Web 2.0, or even like HTML5 or CSS3. Even responsive design, like these aren't like a specific technology or a specific thing. It's generally a group of technologies that make a broader approach possible. And I think in the case of Jamstack, you know, like for example, responsive design, people think about media queries, but there's actually a lot of other things that kind of made responsive design possible. I think actually Ethan McCott, there's 3 he actually lists, and I think it's fluid design. So being able to use percentages, media queries, and sure, there's another one. Justin, do you know them by heart?
Yeah, fluid design, fluid grids,
Mm.
media queries, and responsive images.
Yeah, nice. Well done. But yeah, so essentially, you know, it's very rare that like these kind of like approaches tend to revolve around a single piece of technology. And so the Jamstack actually comes more from, you know, like what, like, let me start with this, you know, like, so this is an actual image from an article that I found. It's amazing. But, you know, everyone knows this, you know, like, it gets quoted so much, you know, like, what are the 2 most hardest things in computer science? You know, cache invalidation and naming things. And then there's another one that's like the 2 most, the 2 hardest things in computer science is cache invalidation, naming things, and off by 1 errors. But yeah, essentially, like this kind of like a lot of Jamstack comes from the space of just like how complicated caching became and just how convoluted caching became. And one of the big stories around kind of like the development of this approach comes from Smashing Magazine. So some of you might know Smashing Magazine, some of you might not know Smashing Magazine. They were the real big first like site to like take kind of, I guess, like try out what would later be called the Jamstack. In terms of like all of this is just static HTML and JavaScript and CSS. There's no server here. Like this is literally just sending these files down the wire. So if I open up my network tab and I reload, let's just see index.html. Oh no, it wouldn't be index.html, it would be the actual domain name. So this. So this is an actual index.html file. This isn't something that a server created. This is an actual real index.html file. If I were to go here, this is an actual index.html file that lives on a CDN somewhere. And so, but like, here's the thing. They have like, you can log in, you can search, you can, you know, they have an entire like e-commerce solution on here. You can purchase things. So like, if you're kind of new to this world of Jamstack, you might be like, how the hell do you do that without like some kind of like PHP server or Django or something? And we're going to get to that. But like, it's worth to note that they were the real first big player to kind of develop. They played a very big role in developing this approach, and they have thousands and thousands of articles. So like, essentially, you know, they kind of just went through constant iterations of the caching setup, because you can imagine, you know, like they probably get, if this was a database and these would dynamically be created from a database, the amount of user traffic that they see like is insane. Like they would, I think they maybe in the quote on, it might not be in the quote, but I remember like I read an article once where they said like their site would like constantly like go down if like they had an article that was super popular, that was shared very widely. So they kind of like did a lot of work into caching, and essentially for those of you that don't know what caching essentially takes a screenshot of a page, and then it just sends that screenshot instead of like creating the page from the database every single time. That way, otherwise you're hammering the database. Every single user that visits your site is going to make a request to the database. Yeah, so they kind of spent a lot of time like looking into caching solutions, and they say that even after considerable efforts, the site still struggled to reach acceptable uptime and performance goals. And they said it introduced a great many plugins, and libraries and dependencies for their WordPress, Rails, and Kirby setups. Uphill battles to keep numerous WordPress plugins and Ruby gems and other libraries up to date. And still, like the site went offline every now and then. And essentially, so what they kind of did is they kind of took a look back and they kind of looked at the origins of the web and kind of asked, like, why did we not have these scalability issues in this like world? So first and foremost, like I think obviously just the amount of users that were using the web was considerably lower. So obviously you didn't have that amount of traffic. But the other thing is as well, keep in mind also that the infrastructure was a lot more rudimentary. You didn't get like, scaling, you didn't get like load balancing, all of those things that you get with like kind of a modern server infrastructure. So like, yeah, also keep that in mind. But so they went back and they kind of realized that, the thing is that like, it's because it was like static content. It was essentially just a file that was served from a server. There was no actual logic that needed to execute either on the client side or on the server side. It was literally just static files. And they kind of looked and thought like, this is essentially what we are doing now. We're just using all these crazy like caching tools and plugins and whatever to essentially just recreate like these static like files again. And the worst part is like this is done like on the server itself. So we don't even create them in a controlled environment like we would with like in this day where you would like actually just hand code the HTML and so forth. So things can still go wrong, like an article can get published and the caching might break or whatever. And so they kind of looked at like, is there not a better way? And essentially what they came up with is like what is known today as the Jamstack. And they wrote a really phenomenal book on it by O'Reilly called Modern Web Development on the Jamstack. And like essentially, I like the term that they use is, they talk about shortening the stack. So like they start by saying, executing zero code will always be faster than executing some code. So like they start by looking at like, what is the code that we can just take out that doesn't need to be actually executed in the runtime? Obviously in this day, in the past, like that was everything. Like there was no code that executed during runtime. And so they looked at like, how can we remove tiers from kind of like this MVVM stack that just has become so fat? And, like essentially they tried to shorten the chain. And what's really nice is, like once they started doing that, they kind of realized that operations, which teams used to spend large amounts of time and money on to optimize in an effort to speed them up, they are not really an issue anymore if you do them outside of runtime. So, like they started looking at, can we do a lot of this in a build process that like runs outside of the actual runtime that the user is looking at the site? And like essentially this is, sorry for my super rudimentary drawings. Like I just drew on top of like this way original, where is it now? On this original like Web Forms 2.0 specification I just drew directly on that. So here I kind of just illustrated how that idea, how we can take that same approach and turn it into kind of like an MVVM. And then like in terms of, then I also like just kind of illustrated how you would do the same with kind of like a Jamstack. Looking at this, it would be hard to believe that I'm actually a designer by profession. But yeah, see it as avant-garde. So essentially, you would take this like MVVM approach at the top there, where you had like this fat amount of JavaScript, you know, that all of that yellow. And you would like squeeze it down, but you would squeeze it down by like taking some of that functionality and like expanding like horizontally, like offsetting it into other places. So, you know, like now your actual chain itself, from the actual like business logic to the view model to the actual what the user sees is like compressed quite a lot. It's very short, and that is because like you have like these like horizontal routes that data come from now. So let's start over here. You know, like you have your services. So whether this is a headless CMS, whether this is like graph CMS, or like Netlify CMS, or Contentful, or maybe even like something like Shopify, or even a headless WordPress. And then like you actually run atomic builds. So you usually have a webhook that fires whenever anything changes on here, and then it rebuilds all the static assets and it just pushes it up to a CDN. So this just lives on a CDN in the cloud, like in several locations, because these are static files. You know, if we look at something like Cloudflare, when we're using a CDN, like you have loads of servers like all over the world that it gets pushed to. So, you know, for Cloudflare, here's an example, you know, so whereas you might, if you are maybe using an EC2 instance, or you have an actual server, it might just be in one location like Ireland or the US or whatever. Now, because it's static files, you can just push it out to all these different CDN servers. And like more often than not, you do this completely free, so you don't pay any hosting, because it's essentially the same as just having a file in Google Drive or having a file in S3 or whatever. And yeah, so now like you're kind of like, so you're circumventing all of this, and you're whatever you can pre-build as HTML and CSS, you just like push out to the CDNs, and like immediately they get pulled down. And then you have like a very thin like JavaScript view model that like just talks to the server, talks to the services, like in terms of like the things that you can't do with static HTML and CSS. So in the case of what is it called? Like Smashing Magazine, you would have like if you were to purchase a book or whatever, or you would sign up, or you would create your account, or register for an event, or so forth. Like that, you unfortunately can't do with only static files, but you would actually still use the static files, and we just enhance that bit of functionality with like a very small like JavaScript layer. And this can either talk directly to the services, or like if you want a bit more granular control, you can send it just through a cloud function that just mediates the relationship between your client and the actual service. So cloud functions are so cheap. I think on Amazon, like I don't. Let's just have a look at Amazon Lambdas. Let's say Amazon Lambda pricing. So at the moment, yeah, you know, like for a million requests, it's 2 cents. That is insane. Like, yeah. wherever wherever we've kind of used this approach, like to be honest, the actual tech infrastructure usually ended up being cheaper than most of the other services that the company uses. So like more often than not, like a lot of the times, like the product would have a MailChimp account to send out marketing emails, and the MailChimp bill would be like 3 times the actual tech build for the actual digital product itself. It's just insane in terms of like how cheap this is compared to having like a full-blown server. And you can get away with like I have a couple of like Jamstack sites that are completely free. So obviously the FedSA one is like just static assets hosted on Netlify. We don't pay a cent for this, but this is obviously a very rudimentary example. But then, like there are other ones, like for example, so the work that I did for National Treasury for something called Vulekamali, which is just a breakdown of all like the spending by, well, this is actually not for National Treasury, it's in cooperation of civil society. It kind of has a breakdown of like all the data for like where do departments spend their money and so forth. It's loads and loads of data. You can imagine just the size of this data, and like to date, we haven't spent a cent on this product. Like the overheads, apart from the labor, is 0. Yeah, so like you can just the amount of money that you can save with this is insane, and like there's just so many other benefits in terms of performance and so forth. But I think like we can talk a bit about like the drawbacks and so forth. There are some drawbacks. But like the reality is with most approaches, you have like you're paying for it in some way, so you just decide where you want to pay. I would much rather like pay in terms of the ways that like the drawbacks of the Jamstack than any of the other approaches. I'm finding like the drawbacks a lot more reasonable. But like I think what I find like the most empowering, and like Justin can probably attest to this as well, is that I think in a lot of like the monolithic like structures, like you get the actual structure itself very much dictates the interface, and this has definitely been the case in a lot of products that I worked on previously, whether it was Magento or some other like Django or whatever. If you're kind of using like an entire big web framework that generates those pages for you on the fly, it mostly does it like within its own logic and templating language. So you have a lot, like I know a lot of UX designers and product designers and so forth who have worked with tech teams, and they essentially reach a point where they realize their hands are tied because they can't really make any meaningful decisions, because so much of the decisions in terms of the interface, how things work, like is made by the actual framework itself. That they have to work within so many constraints that they can't really do anything meaningful. And like this is essentially a case where the tail is wagging the dog. I think we're definitely moving into a space where the user experience and the interface itself is kind of growing in importance. And like, but a lot of teams are still building with tools that don't give them a lot of freedom in terms of how they want to do their interfaces. But it's also important, so this is a direct quote from that book, where they say, like it's also important that when evaluating the reasons that like they feel monolithic apps are no longer serving the growth of the web, they're kind of careful to not insult the hundreds of thousands of development teams that chose to implement it. Yeah, and I want to kind of do the same as well. Like I definitely see the Jamstack. I'm a massive fan, but like I'm definitely open to it not really being something that resonates with other people. It works very nicely with the way that I tend to build things. And specifically in terms of what I mentioned, the freedom to do good work, to design the exact experience we want for our users. Because a lot of the logic is abstracted away behind APIs. There's that leaves, like, whether we're using 11t or React or Gatsby or whatever, we have a lot of control over the interface, and it's completely decoupled from the business logic, which is something that, like, even in my own career, I can say, like, the design decisions that I've made, and even just the architectural decisions I've made in terms of JavaScript and so forth, have a lot of times been compromised by kind of complex monolithic applications. And I think this kind of leads me into another topic, the expectations of what users are expecting from the web is just increasing. In recent years, the complexity of front-end architectures has exploded. The browser has evolved, like APIs have grown. Like Justin and I oftentimes speak that, if you follow any of these newsletters, like about like CSS or HTML or JavaScript and so forth, like you just see there's like just new APIs getting released every day. Native APIs in the browser, things are just moving at an insane speed. But the thing is here, I personally think that labor is getting like a lot more specialized. Once again, going back to just in general trends, like what the amount of skill sets that no, I can't find it. let me just scroll through my slides. Yeah, the amount of like actual skill sets that you require, different skill sets to build something like this compared to building something like that. Like this could probably be done by a single person, and it was probably, like back in the day, like the title was kind of called webmaster. You were kind of like the webmaster. You like did everything for the website. Whereas here, like within the kind of the web app world that we live in today, like we have a lot more specialization of labor. I know, like I spoke to someone at one point, or no, you know what it was? It's like there's a guy who I kind of follow. I can't remember his name now. He's an Indian guy that works at at Google. He presents their UX courses, and his role is specifically, his title is he's head of user experience design within user privacy. That's all he focuses on. He just does like focuses on the user experience when it comes to user privacy. And obviously, like we're not necessarily all working for Googles and Netflixes and so forth, but I think definitely within the realm of kind of just like the more moderate range of web apps, we're seeing a lot more specialization of labor. And and like that used to be a big problem with monolithic apps. It's very difficult for the same person to be both an expert in client-side JavaScript performance and server-side development and database queries and cache optimization and infrastructure. Yeah, and like I've worked with teams before where essentially like you can very much paint yourself into a corner where you're building a product in a way that essentially there's no room for intermediates or juniors. You can only hire seniors because you need to understand the entire structure from the database all the way to the actual browser, just to make any meaningful changes, just because it's so tightly coupled. Yeah, and that's obviously a big problem. That's obviously a big problem for like a team. If you can only hire seniors, and obviously I don't want to name the team, but I worked with a very specific team where that was a problem, and they actually that was 3 years ago, and they are actually not around anymore because it just wasn't sustainable. And that's because the size and complexity, of our architecture is directly proportional to the quantity of people and range of skills required to operate it. And that's not a bad thing, so when we look at movies, so one of the very first commercial movies called The Roundhay Garden Scene, 1888, which is also interestingly enough the same year that first paper form that I showed comes from. But the credited crew for the movie is 7 people. And there's so little of them that they are actually put on the poster itself. Then you look to something like Marvel Avengers Endgame, which is now already 2 years ago. There's probably a movie nowadays that has an even bigger budget. But then, the amount of credited crew is close to 500. And this is only people that were in the credits. This wasn't the guy who swept the janitor, or who just cleaned up the space, or maybe came and fixed the plumbing or whatever. These are actually just people that are in the credits, and that just shows the scale of the things that we are doing and building nowadays. And obviously, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm pretty sure, unless you're some type of movie hipster, that you would probably enjoy the latter more than the former. Looking at you, Justin. But yeah, so I think the Jamstack to me gels really well with this. It's a lot easier to kind of specialize labor, to kind of have someone just focus on the part that they want to do. For example, if you're really good at CSS, you can just write CSS. You don't need to understand anything about the database, the way data gets queried. If you architect your project well, I even times have a split between the actual presentation and the actual API, or the presentation and the stateful logic. So now you can have someone who can just work on in a React project, can just work on the markup and the CSS and so forth. They don't need to understand how state is managed, how we know that the user is signed in or not signed in. With something like Storybook, they can literally just make changes to how would it look if someone signed in, how would it look if someone signed out. Whereas previously with monolithic apps, you would probably need to spend 2 days just getting a local development version of the site working, download the entire staging DB, spin that up, and only when you have that working, now you can actually change the color of a button from purple to green. Yeah. So then just lastly, before I want to kind of open the floor for some broader discussion, I think it's important for me to mention that there are drawbacks to the Jamstack. Anything comes with a cost. There's this, I would be hesitant of anyone who says their approach is kind of a silver bullet that's just going to solve everything. I think the type of things that we're building on the web is just so broad and so Xandor, some of you might know him. He I don't even know, maybe he's here. He told me once that the web for him is definitely split into 2 different phases. In the beginning, no one really knew what the web was. Everyone was trying to figure out what the web is. And then in the second phase, where everyone thought they knew what the web was and were telling you what the web is and what it isn't is. Yeah, I come from a kind of a time where we try to figure out what the web is. So I would be hesitant of anyone that kind of claims they have a universal solution that works for Bob the Plumber's website, works for Netflix, works for Figma, works for slides.com. I just feel the things that we're building are so disparate. But that being said, I think there's a lot of things that we are building that can benefit a lot from the Jamstack. And I also think it's definitely very underutilized, but it is still, I don't think it's that mainstream yet. I think it has some way to still go. But I think there's a lot of room for it to provide a lot of value. Yeah, and I think that's about it. I covered quite a lot. I didn't get into the technical side that much. Because I was hoping that Gareth is going to be able to do a bit of a demo, like how you would set something like this up with serverless and so forth. But yeah, like, I don't know, maybe if there's time or if there's anything specific that anyone wants me to demo, like we can definitely do that. Yeah, but I'm curious to kind of just hear any general thoughts, anyone to kind of share their experiences with the Jamstack. I know Martin has built a couple of Jamstack sites. I know Justin has. So if there aren't any actual questions, let me just check the chat. No, I'm curious to kind of get your view, kind of if there's anything that I kind of touched on that kind of resonated with you, or whether there's anything that you kind of disagree with, and that's doesn't really kind of fit with like kind of how you see and approach things.
Thanks, Schalk. That was a great presentation. Can you share your slides with us?
I will do that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've been building Jamstack sites for a long time, all the way back to good old Jekyll.
Good old, oh, yeah.
I do agree with you that I think it's a very new paradigm, and it's not widely adopted, but it has been adopted by like significant large companies, I think. I think there's definitely a huge future for it. I mean, from my experience, I can say the projects we've worked on where we've incorporated Jamstack technologies, as you say, if you follow a kind of design system storybook, and then some kind of a front end like Next or Gatsby or whatever it is, you just get so much out of the box without having to do crazy kind of caching strategies and all these kinds of things that you need to do with a traditional kind of monolithic application. And you can decouple your data sources from your front end so effectively. And there's what I found really great about what you said was this like high area of specialization that we seem to be entering into, and how this, if you build your team right, how the Jamstack gives people with very specific strengths the opportunity to really play and shine in those areas. Because you're always going to have someone on your team, say front-end developers, and someone's going to be like seriously good at CSS, right? And maybe that's all they want to do. And you can really, because of the way the architecture works, you can really focus your kind of expertise within your team really so greatly. And people aren't just working on this one massive application where they're expected to do everything and know everything. It's becoming impossible to do that. And the Jamstack as a kind of development philosophy, very much, to my mind, lends itself to the kind of specialization we're seeing more and more in the front end.
No, definitely. Yeah, I can definitely think. I can definitely think of an example where I worked on a project that kind of did a lot of work with kind of like videos and so forth. And so like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's similar. You probably know Cloudinary. But there's one for videos that kind of like does a lot of great things. Like it generates like all the different versions for you. It's able to actually determine based on like like
Wistia.
Sorry?
Is it Wistia?
let me see. It's been quite I'll maybe check a bit later, but you are probably right. So that's the thing. Like, you know, if I couldn't just use like a software as a service for that, I would probably need to upskill myself in the intricacies of like streaming videos.
Yeah.
And you know, and like I guess that's fine. I've had to do that a couple of times in my career, but then I'm never probably going to work on a site that does something like that ever again. And you know, now I kind of need to just master everything. Whereas in that case, I can be like, you know, I'll just defer to these guys. They probably have a lot of experience with it. They're domain experts. I'm happy to just pay them more money than it would have been if I tried to figure it out. You know, there's kind of that saying that what's it like? Linux is only free if your time doesn't cost anything. Whether that's true or not, but like I think the principle, you know, like I think a lot of people forget that. They're like, yeah, but you know, like I don't want to pay Auth0 X amount per month. I can just maintain my own authentication service. Well, first, it's not going to be free. You know, you're probably going to pay like Heroku, or you know, it might not be the same amount. But I think people neglect to take into account like labor costs. And that's a conversation that like, and this is a bit broader than Jamstack, but like that's a conversation I've had with a lot of people before. Like, especially at OpenUp, like I think we would definitely like encourage like some of our designers to just build something in Squarespace. Like if it's just a basic static page, because you know, like once you take into account like labor hours and so forth, it's probably going to end up being cheaper. And like you are actually like then just deferring to someone who has a lot of experience with the actual thing that you want. And I find it to be the same with things like Auth0. I've recently started playing around with FaunaDB. I don't know if you've used FaunaDB before.
No, I know of it, but I haven't used it.
It's really amazing. Like if there's maybe time, I can do a quick demo. It's just like, oh, like I haven't been, like I think the last time I was this excited about something was Netlify. It's really amazing. You essentially just provide it with a GraphQL schema, and then it sets up the entire DB structure for you in accordance with that. It's like instant GraphQL database. It's amazing.
Fantastic.
Yeah, like so.
Auth0 is a great example. I mean, if anyone has built their own authentication and like role-based system, don't do it. There's questions from Martin.
Yes.
Could you possibly go over some drawback examples?
No, I can definitely.
Yeah, and then another question as well from Martin. You know, how would you say a good way to implement a Jamstack easily would be? You know, like create React app or something like that.
Sure, I see the questions are flowing now. Okay, so let me start with kind of drawbacks. I think a glaring one that we shouldn't underestimate is maturity. Even the worst possible web framework that you could use at this time. I can name a couple, but I'm not going to. Luckily, Jekyll isn't a web framework. But I'd say Ruby on Rails for me is pretty up there. Even that has the benefit of like a massive level of maturity and refinement that we don't have with the Jamstack just yet. I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that it is still quite new. It's exciting, but I would always keep that in mind for now. That, you know, like we are still ironing out some of the issues. I think a big one that people are kind of trying to address at the moment is kind of incremental builds. and there isn't necessarily, I almost want to say, best practice just yet. So what I mean by that is, like if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of articles on your website, and every time anything updates, a new build needs to run. For example, that is one of the drawbacks of that National Treasury site that I showed that we worked on, me and a good friend of mine, JD. But is that I think that build needs to run overnight. Luckily, that's not that bad, because that site, the budget only gets released every year. So after the budget speech, we get the data and we just kind of feed it in and generate all the new pages once a year. If you are publishing articles every day, that's a tough one. I know Gatsby Cloud has been playing around with it a bit. I've been hearing conflicting things about the success of that. Some people have said that it is actually working out pretty great. I know Netlify is also playing around with kind of a way to kind of do incremental builds, so it only rebuilds what changed. How I tend to solve that is I tend to draw a line, I make a deliberate decision in terms of what is going to get pre-rendered and what am I just going to put in the view model, like in the actual runtime JavaScript, and maybe just hit the API directly. That is generally just based off critical content. Whereas the homepage might be like rebuilt every time, I might not rebuild every single, let's say, like user photo gallery or whatever, but those are trade-offs we need to make that we don't get with kind of your server-side rendering. Yeah, the other ones are one thing though is that one of the drawbacks is that there are a lot of moving parts. That is one of the benefits that a monolithic structure has, is that everything's very centralized, everything's very nicely abstracted. With Jamstack, I find that sometimes there are a lot of moving parts that you need to be mindful of, a lot of different services. But to me, that's something that I can live with in terms of picking my poisons. To me, that's a better outcome than having a monolithic structure and being constrained in terms of what the structure anticipates I want to do with it. Yeah, then there are some other ones, but most of these are the other one I would say lastly is one benefit that a lot of the server-side services have is that for example, something like WordPress and so forth, it's very easy to give a preview as you're editing the content to show what the page is going to look like. We don't necessarily have that best practices for that with the Jamstack just yet, but I know Netlify CMS has kind of a built-in solution. I know things like StatBit seeks to kind of rival kind of WordPress. I would definitely keep my eyes on StatBit. I think they are going to cannibalize. Maybe in the next 3 years, they're going to cannibalize a lot of kind of the market share that WordPress has when it comes to just essentially basic websites. So, essentially a digital brochure, which doesn't really need an entire LAMP stack and a SQL DB and dynamic scripting and those type of things. But yeah. Most of these are things that are being ironed out, but just be mindful that they are being ironed out. We don't necessarily have best practices for some of these just yet. In terms of how would I implement, for example, Create React app? Yeah, with Create React app, definitely Gatsby or Next.js. Vue has Gridsome. I think it also has VuePress. Angular got a static site generator recently, and what's nice about the Yeah. What's nice about those is that you can, if you're already familiar with something like Vue or whatever, you can just leverage that, and you don't necessarily need to learn much. You can just like use that to generate static assets for you. 11T is the other one. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of tend to oscillate with 11T. Sometimes I really like it. Other times I'm like, no, I'm done with this. Yeah, like 11T for me sits. Huh?
ASP.NET MVC 5 has a static site generator.
What is that?
Even that has a static site.
Oh,
it's called YAM.
YAM. But yeah, like yeah, the thing for me, 11T sits at kind of that weird place where it's a simple solution, but it's kind of between complex and simple for me. It's not simple enough. Whereas, you know, like it's not that much simpler than something like Gatsby. Then I might as well just go like full on. But yeah, I don't know.
I think it depends on your use case. 11T is great for like a personal website or a blog or something like that. And what's nice about 11T as well is it doesn't tie you into any kind of framework. So you can use whatever you like. You can write plain old vanilla JavaScript and it will compile for you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you want to do that, of course.
Yeah. But like, so like, I'm actually pretty excited. Like, I think this is where the future lies. But I'm putting myself out there a bit. I think we're going to get serialization for web components at some point, and I think that's going to change everything. And someone is probably
spoke about that in the podcast. I think we came up with the year 2032.
Did we? 2032?
Yeah.
Just like at least we got container queries before then. But like I think that's going to change a lot of things. So like once we get to a point where we can generate like static pages from web components, so we can serialize web components, I think that's going to be a game changer. Yeah. We have Stencil at the moment, but I think Stencil is for me a bit too tied into kind of like the whole Ionic Angular kind of ecosystem, that it doesn't, to me, it feels like you're foregoing the benefit of web components, because then you're essentially just opting into someone else's kind of system again. But yeah, like that, I would definitely keep my eyes on that. That's an exciting space, and I think we're going to eventually get some type of like Jamstack web component, progressive web app type thing. Yeah, that I'm very much looking forward to kind of that. So the other questions, let me have a quick look. Jamstack lends itself to quick plug and play sites similar to WordPress. How much complexity can be offloaded? Yeah. So, okay, Jordan just kind of essentially echoes what I'm saying. And yeah, and I think what's nice about that is that process is also progressive. So like, and I think like the FedSA website is a good example. We probably want to start including some other things at another point, like maybe like showing the actual upcoming talks on there. Like, and to be honest, kind of the meetup, like just management system tools are just absolute. So like, I know a lot of teams kind of just like a lot of meetups and so forth just have their own parallel like things to let people know when events are happening and so forth. So I think what's very nice is that we actually start with just the design and the basic HTML, and then we can progressively add those things on top of it. Whereas with a monolith, we would need to decide up front, like what is it that we want to build, and then like we need to stick to that. Like, and if we want to veer away from that, we're going to have a hard time. I've seen that happen quite a bit.
And if I can just add to that as well, Schalk, with that site as an example, I mean, we've just basically put a bunch of information up there, and it's just living in HTML and some Markdown. but because we've hosted on Netlify as well, we can, hook into things that Netlify offers you for nothing, like forms, authentication, identity, and then a whole host of plugins, up from image optimization to accessibility tests on your builds, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So all of that kind of stuff, even analytics, all that kind of stuff that you would normally have to, go and build contact forms and have a database to store your entries or hook it up to Google Forms or whatever. With a service like Netlify that's purely meant for Jamstack, they handle all that for you.
What's also really nice is, so for example, like we probably want to hit the Meetup API, but the Meetup API, you need to have an API key. So obviously you can't do that straight from the front end. So this is where something like a cloud function would come in. But or you would either you would do it in a cloud function, but even that's overkill. What you would probably just do is you would hit that in the actual build process. And then you would just rebuild the site every day or whatever, and you just get the new info from Netlify, from Meetup, because there's no reason why you need to hit that API every single time a user hits the site, because more often than not, you're not going to add events of it's fine if there's a bit of a delay before it shows up on the site. You have a maximum of a day. And that is just, for me, amazing. I think that's kind of what we did with the Cape Town Together stuff as well. A lot of the kind of, I don't want to say APIs, just get hit when the site gets built, and we just rebuild the site each morning.
And what you can also do with the cloud functions on something like Netlify is that you only need to build something that's changed. So when you run your build, you don't need to rebuild your entire site. You're just looking for any API that's changed since the last build, and that's the only thing it's going to run and build, which is really fantastic.
Yeah, and what I've done quite a bit is, and I kind of feel like it's cheating a bit almost, is I have some students that are building things with Graph CMS, because it's just such a nice platform to work with, and it exposes everything as kind of GraphQL, but once you get to a certain number of requests, the pricing gets pretty steep. So I think you get 1,000 requests per month or something like that. So what you do now, instead of just requesting the site every time a user hits, you do the exact same. You just rebuild the site maybe in the morning, and you automatically trigger a rebuild late in the afternoon. So there's maybe a maximum of, let's say, a 12-hour delay before content showing up. And, you generally have these things for caching as well. I remember, I don't want to name the team, but I worked at a team where we had a massive e-commerce store. And I know some people who work at TGIF as well. And they essentially do what is just a very convoluted rebuild 2 times a day, or when the merchandisers add new things. And to me, that sounds very much it's obviously caching and indexing and whatever, but to me, that sounds very similar to just building a Jamstack site. Except you don't have all that stuff in between. You're just directly building it in a controlled environment. But so the thing is with the Graph CMS, so if we split that up, so we can update it every X amount of hours, we just make sure you're not gonna how many times are you gonna run that? Definitely not more than 1,000 a month. You can indefinitely stay within the free plan. It's amazing, so you get to use Graph CMS, and the amount of requests you do are just when the site rebuilds. So there's you're gonna have to do a lot of rebuilds to hit 1,000. So it kind of feels a bit like cheating, but it gets the job done. Yeah.
Have you looked at Strapi at all, Schalk?
No, I've actually been more keen to play around with Sanity. As far as I understand, they're pretty similar, are they not?
They are. Strapi has a community edition.
Is it?
And you just host it yourself. That's free forever. So you're not constrained by any of those worries around requests. There's another question from Matt. And this is a great question because I think this is a really confusing thing. Is Markdown the same as markup?
Sure.
And would something like JSX fall under the markdown or markup side of things? That's a great question.
Yeah.
I also tackle it.
So like I would actually start with the second one. So what's a good way to get your feet wet if you haven't done? So first and foremost, if you already know something, if you already know React, I would go Gatsby. What's nice about Gatsby is just for Jamstack. Whereas Next.js can do Jamstack, but it also can do loads of other things. So if you know React, go Gatsby. If you know Vue, give Gridsome a try. Gridsome is also a specific Vue-specific Jamstack solution. And I can't remember what I also see that Jordan mentioned Svelte. So Svelte also has Sapper. And the other one is Angular. I can't remember what the Angular one is, but I actually haven't seen anyone really use that.
I find it tricky.
And to me, it's because like Angular, like just conceptually doesn't gel that well for me with kind of like the Jamstack approach. But I might be kind of like not I might be like incorrect here, but like from what I understand of Angular and the bit of Angular work that I've done, it's not that easy to translate it into a Jamstack project. And then
as David says, sorry, Schalk, as David says, it's Angular Universal.
Yes.
And there's another one that's also called Scully.
Scully is the one. Scully is the one. And Scully seems to be a direct competitor to Gatsby and Gridsome. And then if you just want to do like straight up, like, handlebars, or if you know handlebars, if you know, what are all the ones? Mustache,
Nunjucks,
Liquid,
literals.
Liquid, which is what Jekyll uses. If you know any of those, give 11t a try. Otherwise, like if you literally just want a one-click solution similar to WordPress, check out StackBit. I'll maybe like share a link on the event for StackBit. StackBit is very much looking to be so it's very interesting, their approach. I'm very fascinated by what they're doing. So they're kind of developing their own templating language called, I think, Unibit or something, which you can use then with like any Jamstack platform. So you can create a template that you can then use on Gatsby, or you can use it on Gridsome or 11t or whatever. That's very fascinating. But yeah, check out StackBit. StackBit, like I think as a introduction is really great. But it's kind of like you can completely do everything through the UI. You don't need to write any code. It's kind of like a plug and play solution. Yeah, cool. So what are some of the other ones? Oh, Markdown, markup. So I think Chris Coyer wrote an article where he jokingly said they should have called it the sham stack. Let me see, where he actually talks about this, like markup. So he says, so he would say sham would be a static hosting API and markup sham stack. But yeah, I think the markup side is they don't explicitly say HTML because, I think it's maybe to make it a bit more future friendly. And as you rightfully pointed out, so JSX is strange because JSX is also bold time. It's not actually outputting HTML. So I think, like, to be honest, I think they just went with markup because Jamstack sounds a lot more enticing than the jar stack. But yeah, like effectively, I consider it markup as kind of essentially HTML. I know, like, there's some, and I think these are the type of discussions that I'm not finding that interesting. Like, you know, there's some discussion whether is Flutter, can Flutter be considered Jamstack, because effectively, you know, like you can output HTML and things with it, and you know, it's client only, and I don't know, like there are some people that say you need to have JavaScript for it to be considered a Jamstack. Some people say no, like a general static site also counts as Jamstack. Like those are the type of conversations that I'm not finding very interesting at all. So I can't.
Yeah, and I think that's why there's been such a specific move away from that acronym as well.
Yeah.
Like the Jamstack site used to be the J, the A, and the M, you know, and they've changed that completely now, just to talk more to static rendering and utilizing CDNs and APIs.
Yeah, and like in such a classic, I can't think of anything more web than like anything more like in line with the web than something that started out with an idea that sounded very cool, and then in retrospect we realized, like, oh, okay, no, this was a bad idea, but we're stuck with it now. You know, like that's exactly. The most web thing I can think of, and I think that's the thing with Jamstack. I think everyone's kind of regretting the name, but you know, it is what it is, and I think that the main thing there is, like, a lot of people talk about, like, is the Jamstack just hype? And to me, like, that's a very strange thing to ask. Like, just hype? Like, hype is an amazing thing. Like, you know, like we wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for all the hype around HTML5 and CSS3. But, like, you know, what were those things essentially? They weren't anything specific. They were essentially just kind of a way to describe something that's happening. You know, like it's not always clear where HTML5 begins and where it ends, and the same with CSS. And I think it's the same with the Jamstack. I think, like, with Jamstack, the main move there was just that, like, static sites have a pretty negative connotation, just because of the word static. So if you were to try and sell a client on building a static site, you would have a hard time. And that, to me, is the main reason for the term Jamstack. It's just to have a different type of language to describe this that doesn't necessarily have the negative connotations of static sites. Because, you know, once again, if you talk about static sites, what do you think about? You think about those 1999 examples that I showed, which is, you know, tables and, you know, sliced Photoshop images and those things.
And also the implication that you're sitting there writing all the HTML by hand on every single page, and wrapping all your paragraphs, you know, in P tags and whatnot. But that's really not the case. Jordan says, which is a really good thing as well. I mean, this is something that's really great about Jamstack and static site generators, that they're amazing for rollbacks. Because everything's Git based on something like Netlify. You get a deploy preview every time you do a pull request, which is fantastic. And yeah, no, as you said, no worries about Friday build. You can just roll it back anytime because it's Git based. And that's one of the major things for me, is that everything lives inside your repository, and all the version control that you have at your disposal applies to what you're putting out to production. And rolling it back is like as simple as just a click of a button, really. As opposed to, in a monolithic architecture, if you go and you do your 4-hour, okay, that's probably, I mean, we work with banks. I mean, some deploys are like 12 hours. You aren't rolling that back.
And good luck figuring out like what you actually need to roll back. Like what that would even involve. Exactly. Like you would need to create like a new Docker image and definitely.
Nightmare,
like we do this.
No, I just wanted to say this is maybe a good time before everyone jumps off when we're talking about like Netlify, that we actually have, and Schalk, you've been quoting him throughout your presentation. We actually have Phil Hawksworth from Netlify joining us in July for a Q&A. So look out for that one. We're going to pretty much go through what Netlify can offer us, which is great. So look out for that one.
No, like I'm super excited about that. I have so many questions. I would need to hold myself back a bit. But like no, for sure. And I think that like we also use Netlify at Biometrics, and it has saved our butts so many times because it's a B2B service. So many times. So you tend to work with work with a small client base. So your kind of your general like B2C things, you have a lot of users that do small purchases and those add up. But then your kind of your B2B things, you have maybe like 100 clients or whatever, and they kind of like you make a lot of money per client. So there, like it's one thing if, your take a lot and 5 users can't like check out. It's a completely different thing if you have like a B2B platform and 5 users can't check out or do whatever they need to do. So many times, like someone has contacted us and said, hey, they can't use the actual thing because of some bug. That was introduced from a new feature, and like obviously they need it like during the day, like they use it in their business. So if we say, oh sorry, the platform is down, then they can't do business that day. So like then we literally just do that Netlify rollback button, and we just roll back, and then we try and figure out like what happened there until we're sure we understand what happened, and then we deploy it again. It is it's so great. Cool.
Jordan, we've already set up a form.
But even better, you can maybe show up and actually ask it in person.
I'll need to check out the Slack. I forgot you guys had a Slack.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but let me pop it in the chat here as well, though.
But also, like, we should probably get. Do we have a date confirmed yet?
No, we don't. So we're actually being joined by Phil Hawksworth and also Kenny. I can't remember his surname. He's a developer advocate at Netlify as well. So, but they've been super busy, and I don't know. I just got an email now to sign up for the Jamstack conference. So, and I know that so they've probably been flat out on that, but I'll be catching up with them later this week just to iron out a date.
But we'll probably put the form on the event itself.
We'll put the form on the event as well, but it'll definitely be sometime in July.
Cool. All right. Yeah, this is a really good session. It might have been a bit too much information from my side, but I think because I was anticipating like Gareth to also be here, I kind of really went into, okay, I'm just gonna every single slide I'm just gonna deep dive into it because now I need to solo this. Whereas I might have structured it a bit differently if I knew from the start that I'm gonna solo this. But yeah, like that's like like I guess that's thematically very relevant here now. And I think like I kind of need to also eat the dog food when it comes to MVPs and like shipping things and so forth. So, even if I'm not ready to do a presentation about something, need to ship. So, yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Yeah. Sure. Okay, you're sharing quite a lot of links there, Justin. I'll maybe share some of these again.
Just two.
When I upload the video. But thanks so much for everyone joining. Like this is great. I'm really looking forward to next month's Q&A. I think even just from my side, I have so many questions. Cool. Yeah. So I don't know if there's anything else that we want to add, Justin.
No, I think that's it. I mean, we'll make that Q&A session live as soon as we get confirmation of the date. And it'll just follow our usual format of asking questions.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll upload this hopefully by the weekend on YouTube, and then I'll also just include some links to some of the things I mentioned, like StackBit and so forth.
Great.
Cool.
Also, part two of episode 2 of the podcast is ready to go up. I think we'll do that next week.
July.
And if anyone wants to be on the podcast, it's basically just hang out and chat about stuff we think is interesting. Give us a shout.
Yeah, I think I've been wanting to have Martin come and chat about like kind of just teaching and mentoring and so forth. I think that would be great. Cool. All right, guys.
Yeah, Jordan, it's new. It's on SoundCloud. Let me just grab the link, Schalk, before you end this. Sorry, SoundCloud UI is so awful.
Yeah, but we still need to include all of bring everything together on the site. But it's just, especially now that I have a daughter coming in September, it's very hard to justify making time for something that's not earning me any money. Even if it's like an hour's work. Yeah. So there's an actual Jordan, you mean it's on GitHub. You can just check on GitHub, if you want to do pull requests. If you want to do that work for us, I'm not going to complain. But I can't say that I'll have to look at the PR first before I merge it. So Matt asked, would Jamstack come up in a PWA episode? I definitely think so, because to me,
I think so too. Yeah.
To me, the Jamstack is definitely kind of a response to offline first, which is something that you couldn't really do with any of these other platforms, approaches like MVC and so forth. So just because the kind of the API part of it is so central. So you need to kind of have a structure like that to be able to do a PWA or a meaningful PWA. There's definitely a lot of overlap. All right, cool. Have a great rest.
Depender bot has been very busy on our site, on our repost.
Yeah. So yeah, he's a bit too dependable. Over dependable.
I haven't looked at it in ages. My personal website is also built with 11C, and that's on GitHub as well. I can share that link as well. It's all do what you want, do what you like, license.
Do what you like, license. I'm going to do a PR request to change the title to Schalk Venter.
I said you can do what you like. I didn't say I would approve.
It's also approve what Justin likes.
But I mean, if you want to fork it or whatever, all good.
Same for mine. All right, guys. Have a great evening. Then we'll chat again next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers all.
Bye.
Bye.